Let's start off just by welcoming Andy. Thanks, Andy, for joining us all the way from the UK, giving up your time. And welcome to all the Repton students that will be tuning in to watch. Hopefully going to give you a little bit of background on soft tissue therapy. Andy is a qualified soft tissue therapist. Has been working in the industry for maybe 15 years or so. Andy,
Correct,
could you just
yeah.
give us a little bit of a background on what you've done? And how
Yeah,
you got there,
so
maybe, and what...
okay, yeah, sure. So initially, I did an undergraduate degree at Cardiff Met University in sport and physical education graduated in 2003. So that was a science-based undergrad. And then following on from that, I just basically worked in the leisure industry, coaching and that for about 12 months whilst I looked into my sort of options beyond that. Physiotherapy was one that was up there, but I just sort of didn't have the appetite to kind of continue with full-time education after 3 years of an undergrad. So sport and remedial massage therapy was something that was very sort of new to the sporting world, or was becoming a lot more established and well known. And it was kind of something that really sort of took an interest, which led me to go on and do a BTEC qualification in sport and remedial massage therapy. And from then, I kind of haven't looked back, and been fortunate enough for the last 15 years to work in elite sport, whilst also sort of having a private practice alongside that where possible.
Brilliant. Yeah. I don't know, maybe you could just touch on, obviously, I've known you for maybe 15 years or so, and many of the chats that we've had have been about your work in the professional sports world. So maybe you could just tell us a little bit about the roles and the jobs you've had, where you've worked, and maybe some of the places it's taken you.
Yeah, sure. So I was fortunate enough that a mutual friend of Adam's and mine was playing professional football for Woking Football Club in the national conference at the time. And not long after qualifying, I found myself sort of going along on a voluntary basis to help out through the course of the season, which kind of gave me a good foundation of what it was like to work in professional football. And just to get an insight into sort of a full-time sporting environment, as well as they were a full-time club at that level at the time. That then took me on to a part-time position with Reading Football Club, who were in the English Football League in the Championship at the time, where I was working on a part-time basis, which then evolved into a full-time position. I was there for about 5.5 seasons, during which time we got promotion to the Premier League, spent 2 years in the Premier League, had the highest points record to go up to the Premier League, which still stands to this date, 106 points. Only lost 2 games all season, so that was something as a team we were all very proud of. And then following my time with Reading, I joined the English Institute of Sport, where I was fortunate enough to work in a multi-sport environment. So I worked with British swimming, modern pentathlon, British athletics, GB canoeing, variety of different sports and performance. Sort of the way they operated was very, very different as well. So I was fortunate enough to get experience in those fields. And during that time with the IS, I think I spent about just over 7 years with them, split between 2 of their sites. But I managed to get selected to go as part of Team GB to the London Olympic Games in 2012 to work with swimming. I went to the Commonwealth Games in Delhi in 2010. Shanghai in 2011 for the World Swimming Championships, Japan for a holding camp, so Qatar and the Aspire Academy again with England for the Commonwealth Games. So not only did it give me a good experience in terms of working in elite sport, but it gave me the opportunity to travel and to kind of go to parts of the world which I would probably never go on holiday. But I think it's also important to kind of stress, and I've spoke to Adam about this in detail in the past, that they sound glamorous and look nice on a passport with the stamp, but the reality of when you travel with sports, and when you, particularly in a competition environment, is you get up early, you have breakfast, you get on a bus, you go to the swimming pool, you're there for 3-4 hours during meal, have lunch, treat, work with the afternoon session, come back at about 9-10 o'clock at night, grab something to eat quickly, go to bed, and then repeat for the next sort of 10-11 days, really. So you don't actually see much of the places you visit until probably the very end, where you might get an afternoon off to go and explore. But it tends to be a very full-on working environment. And it's generally the same in football when you travel as well. You don't sort of get an opportunity to go and explore a lot of places, because it is very much about work and preparation of the athletes you're working with. So following my time with the EIS, I went back into football full time with Swansea City in the Premier League. Which was about 2.5 seasons. And then in January, after a year working self-employed, I found myself back in full-time employment again in private practice with Pure Sports Medicine based in London. So quite a journeyman with lots of different experiences during that time.
Yeah, busy. I know. Stephen, did you want to ask your question whilst we were sort of talking about the professional side?
Yeah, it links in quite well, I think. Andy, thanks for giving up your time. I've got a question. You've dealt with professional footballers, Olympic athletes. Have you noticed a difference with the preparation or their ability to listen to sports science techniques and recovery techniques that you've got? Have you found a difference between, say, footballers and, say, netballers and some Olympic rowers or swimmers? How have you found the differences between those athletes, and how have you adapted what you do with them?
Well, I think fundamentally, the basis behind physiology and certainly when it comes to recovery is that whilst there are differences in each of us as an individual, the fundamentals of human physiology are very much the same. The demands on the athletes obviously change quite a bit. I'd say the one significant difference is more environmental and probably financially related than it is to actually human physiology related. If you take professional football, and particularly where I was recently with Swansea, our training ground had an altitude chamber. It had a HydroWorks therapy pool. It had a cryotherapy chamber. It had multiple watt bikes. We didn't want for any kind of technological advancement that's available to us, because it was there. When you're an Olympic sport and an Olympic athlete, if you're not an athlete in a highly funded sport, access to a lot of these facilities are very limited, and you're relying on sometimes the basics. And not that one is always better than the other. I think football will always have a greater level of funding to be able to say, well, if they've got it, we'll have it, or we want this and we want that, all singing, all dancing training facility. But I think they're all the 1%. If you haven't nailed, your sleep hygiene, if you haven't nailed your hydration and your nutrition, and you haven't sort of managed to get the 80% right, then all these other little things are not going to advance you in terms of your recovery from a physiology perspective as the basics will. So I think where Olympic sports is very much depending on your funding, professional sport can be down to like football can be down to adherence. The other thing I think which plays a huge part is culture beliefs. Generally in Olympic sports, I'd be working with British athletes, so we'd be sort of coming through the same system really. Whereas in football, you got South American, you got European, you got African, you got Asian, and it's very different in terms of maybe what they've been exposed to and what they're used to. Getting an African player into a cryotherapy unit or an ice bath can be very challenging in itself. So not without a full host of gloves and hats and thermal underwear. So I would say they're the main differences that you see. It tends to be driven as opposed to physiological. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's cool. A little lead on from that, in terms of within sports, the top performers, you would have come across some absolute superstars. Did you notice a difference between those that perform well and then they took really good care of their recovery, say? So a bit of a link between the really hard trainer and the hard worker, and you mentioned the word adherence. Were they also really good at adhering to their rehab and took care of themselves and stuff? Have you found a link between that?
Definitely. I think when the athletes that I've worked with, the ones that are consistent, they don't necessarily have lots of things that they kind of have in their locker. It's more about knowing what works for them and being consistent in terms of working with that. And I think that's coupled with a lot of good, appropriate sort of load management as well. Being exposed to things which give them that resilience and that robustness, and then knowing how to recover from that consistently, tend to be the ones that perform at the highest level consistently as well. So not only just doing it on a regularity, it's actually then being able to perform. I think it's no surprise that when you take someone like Cristiano Ronaldo and the age that he is now and the level that he's still performing at, and you look at what he does on a day-to-day basis, it's very, he's very consistent, and I think that's the key thing, is the athletes that have a good season or they have a good few performances, that's possible, but can they do that every game? And then can they do that season after season and stuff? So yeah, I think there's a difference between the ones that adhere to it are the ones that also want to take ownership of their own professionalism. They want to take ownership of their own performance and not rely on other people for them to perform better. And I think that stands true not just for athletes, but I think that stands true for all of us, in terms of how we perform and the level we want to get to. It's having a pathway, knowing how you want to get there, what skills I need to learn along that journey, and I think it's probably poignant for the group that that we're dealing with here is, as a student, if you want to work in an elite sport as a sports scientist or a soft tissue therapist, strength and conditioning coach, you've got to really start thinking about mapping out how you're going to get there and what you need to achieve that, and being consistent against doing that, and not relying on everyone to put you into that position. It's working hard and giving yourself a lot of time. Again, flipping back into the athlete side of things, if you take your top Premiership footballers that are delivering now, Harry Kane was on loan at Preston and didn't necessarily perform for a long time, but going out there exposed him to what he needed to do to work at the top. So it's not where you get to. I think too many people expect to leave an undergrad, leave an MSc, boom, walk straight into a Premier League football club, because they see other people doing it, but what they don't see is how they've got there. And I think that the similarities between the two, I think, are very relevant.
Cool. I got another question, Drake. Can I go one more?
You carry on.
Cool. Andy, you mentioned load management and other, like, sports, the strength and conditioning coach and the coach. How closely do you have to work with the coach, say, and you've got an athlete and you think they're on the edge, they're ready to go, they're ready to have an injury? How close do you work with the strength and conditioning, the coach, when you come across something? Is it something you guys have meetings? How closely do you all work together?
Yeah, I think, again, it depends on the environment and depends on the access and the time you have with your athletes. I'd say generally when you're working in professional football, you're more of an integrated team. So I'll give you an example of kind of a typical day that I would generally be involved in at Swansea City, which will give you an idea of that kind of integrated working. So we through technology, through GPS and the ability to sort of track players' training load these days, we had all this available to us at the football club, and we had an athlete data management system that housed all that data, that we were able to generate reports and dashboards for meetings and discussions about players' level of loading, and that would take into account both their physical training data, but also their general well-being and their wellness data as well. So both internal and external loading. So we would generally meet as a team in the mornings before training, and that would include our head of medical, our GP, our doctor, physiotherapists, strength and conditioning coaches, sports science. One of the first team coaches would join as well. And sometimes our analysts would come in on those meetings, and we'd go through each individual player and discuss their acute and chronic were in terms of risk. And we were fortunate enough that that we had towards the end of my tenure at Swansea, we had a coaching team which were very open to discussions about whether players should train or not. I think it varies from coach to coach and club to club. But if we felt that a player, by doing a particular training session that day, particularly if it was a quite high intensity training session, might be exposed to risk, then we could modify their training to only have part of it, or they'd have an inside training day where they might spend time with the strength and conditioning coach. But I think communication at that level is key. You've got to remove the ego nature that some people have of that I can fix this person or I have all the answers. No one does, and it's about identifying who's the right people to manage that particular athlete at that time, and having the confidence and the knowledge to be able to go to the athlete, have a conversation, but also with the coach or the member of staff to do that. My role as a soft tissue therapist, generally, in football, it's quite hierarchical. We'd sit underneath the physiotherapy team or work a lot closer with the physiotherapist. So if I was treating an athlete that morning who I felt there's something not quite right, ready for training, then I'd next have a conversation with the head physio, who then have a conversation with the doc, and then that would get escalated to the coach, and then it'll get discussed. So I think it's important that communication is very much key in that situation.
Cool.
Yeah. So in terms of that, what time would you sort of start your day? Would you get players or athletes that would come in early, or what do they do after training? Because very much people look at footballers and great, they train for 2 hours a day and then they're off. Would you get many stay behind after who would then come in again for treatment, or would that be your day? How does that work?
Yeah, so I mean, as a soft tissue therapist, our profession is the profession has evolved quite a lot within football over the years. So the 10 years between leaving Reading and starting again with Swansea, quite a lot changed. We from an athlete monitoring perspective, it was very much in the early days heart rate monitors, and rate of perceived exertion was your way of monitoring them. Whereas these days, we've got all sorts of technological advances to be able to do that. So, what we used to do is use those performance meetings to identify any players that were flagged as a potential risk, and be proactively engaging with those players as they came in to work that morning, rather than historically where you'd wait in the medical room and you see you'd come in and they'd wander in and go, oh, can I get a rub on my hamstrings or my quads and things, but there would never really any performance focus to it. Whereas these days you can kind of look at the information and go, right, actually, we know that their hamstrings may be at risk. We know that maybe their hip flexors or quads or calves, whatever it is from the data you have available. And not that we pin our hats on what the data would tell us, but what it would generally do is it would drive a narrative to be able to have an honest conversation with that player and get them to come in. So a lot of what we do before training was very much preparatory. It was getting them ready for their activation-based sessions in the gym before they went out on their pitch, and preparing them for what the session was. Now, once a player's then walks off the pitch, if they've got a second session, which might be their gym session or any rehab-based work, you then pick them up for sort of more recovery-based type of work or any kind of maintenance stuff. So the mornings would tend to be like almost triage based. You'd have 20 minutes tops with a player because you got so many players that you might need to get through. You don't have time to spend an hour's session with them and you try and plan, you manage your athletes and your time as much as you can within that. Generally players like to all come in at the same time, and there's only so many pairs of hands available to treat at that moment in time. But afterwards you can kind of sort of space things out a little bit and stuff. So yeah, it's changed a lot. Days were Reading, you sometimes wouldn't get people in. They'd be training would start at 10:30. They'd come in at 10 o'clock, quick bit of toast, cup of tea, out on the pitch for the warm up, and off the pitch by 12:30, and some are driving out the gates at 1:15. So and I think that's changed a lot, that you can't get away with that type of lifestyle as an elite footballer these days. So you've got to put the hours in and put the time in and prepare yourself better. And again, that's very different from Olympic based sports. I've worked with hockey players and I say other athletes where they're in for 8-9 o'clock in the morning and they don't leave till 5-6 o'clock, and that's 6 days a week. But then they're not playing every weekend. Their competition season is preparing for a regatta or a World Cup or a European Championships, which is 8-9 months away. So they have a training block of 8 to 9 months and then a short competition block, where a footballer will have a short preparatory block, and then their their competition season lasts over 8 months, where it's about maintaining performance. So again, it's very different depending on whether you're an Olympic based sport or a professional sport like cricket, rugby or football.
Thanks for that. Obviously, you've worked in professional sport, but you were telling me the other day when we spoke that it's becoming the percentage of people that actually get into a professional role through soft tissue therapy or physiotherapy or strength and conditioning is getting it's smaller and smaller because there's more and more courses, more and more people want that opportunity to go and work. You went and worked by yourself, didn't you? Self-employed with your own little business. Maybe you could speak a little bit about that and what the difference is you found between the professional side and working on a day-to-day basis with people who just come either for rehab from operations or from their own sporting injuries, but not at the level of a professional.
Yeah, sure. So I think it's very different, both in terms of expectation of what the general public kind of want. Generally a lot of people, if they're your weekend warrior, works in a full-time job, trains a lot around their hours at work and family, will pick up a number of injuries over the years. Some will be rehabbed really well, some may not. They may have done the rounds of seeing chiropractors, osteopaths, physios, been to see their GP and things like that. So everyone's expectation of maybe what they get when they walk in can be very different. So I'd certainly found working in private practice that trying to help educate the general public in terms of what an elite environment might be like is quite new and quite difficult to kind of grasp, because you work quite isolated in private practice. You might work as a soft tissue therapist. I might work I've worked in a physiotherapy practice where there's personal trainers and where there's physios and where, a chiropractor might come in once a week and stuff like that. But generally you don't work in an integrative way. You have your clients, they have their clients, and every now and again you might get a referral, but generally it's not an interdisciplinary team in the same way that it is with football. You don't all sort of come in at different stages of that person's treatment process or rehab process, where it's relevant, you know. So that's certainly very different. And you know, I think you in private practice that you would benefit from being almost a bit more of a generalist as opposed to a specialist. Whereas in elite sport, you know, being a specialist in soft tissue therapy means you know, understanding, you know, strength and conditioning, understanding the other disciplines is important for you to kind of know what you need to do and when you need to do it. But you don't need to sort of take that on board. And I think you also take for granted in elite sport that multidisciplinary team is there already, and it's put in place by the organisation to support you and to support their athletes. Whereas I've certainly found since I've gone back into private practice that you have to work hard at building your own referral network, not just who you refer to, but who refers to you as well. You know, having relationships with surgeons, with GPs, with sport and exercise medicine consultants, and really kind of getting across your skill sets and where you can come in and influence positively on different stages of rehab and post-surgical procedures and stuff. And I think that takes time and that takes effort, which you don't get paid for when you're in private practice working for yourself. But the long term of that is it will generate a stream of people coming in to see you for various different things, you know, as well as building that network of coaches within different clubs and different teams and different sports. You know, it's a lot to take on by yourself, whereas generally in elite sport, the athletes come to you because they're being funded to do so, and you know, you're available to them. But it doesn't always necessarily mean that you're the best practitioner just because you work in elite sport. I think there's a misconception sometimes. There's a lot of good, very good practitioners, but there's also equally some very bad ones that find themselves in very fortunate circumstances that you know, that don't always kind of deliver high performance, if you know what I mean, or not always seeking for high performance. So I think in private practice, if you're busy, then you're generally good because people are paying out their own pocket, you know. And if you're not very good, it's quite simple. They go and find someone else, you know. So you know, whereas you know, an athlete will come and see you because you're there, you know, not necessarily because you're great at what you do. You know, and I think it's important to be mindful of that you're always pushing yourself as a practitioner to be better because you're working with a group of athletes that are trying to do that every day, you know. So if you're not, you'll get found out.
So what would you suggest if we've got anybody who listens to this and thinks, you know what, I want to go and work in that sports physiotherapy, soft tissue therapy? Apart from their actual knowledge, what other skills do you think is important to have? You touched on communication earlier in a couple of your answers, but is there anything else away from the knowledge of the subject and your background that you think they'd need?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, it's important to stress that you know, I sent you a link, Adam, of a guy that I've worked with, Dr. Steve Ingham, who's got a webinar coming up on how to help the graduate get into work in elite sport and to manage those expectations. And he wrote in a blog a while ago about it was called A Letter for the 15,000, and in short what he meant by that blog is that in the UK alone, between 9,000 and 15,000 sports science degree programs, people leave there at the end of their 3-year degree. And, you know, some of them will go on and do a master's. And, you know, if you're fortunate enough to be one of those that walks out of a master's degree program in sports science with a distinction, you will be one in 1,200 people in the UK that's got the opportunity to go and work in sport based on your qualifications out of university. So 1 in 1,200 is quite small You know, it's a bit like an academy player, you know, trying to make it as a professional football. Less than 2% actually make it into the game. The rest are kind of moved out and have to find something else for the rest of their career to do. So if you bear in mind, if you take the Premier League as an example, and if you're an aspiring sports scientist that wants to work in football at the highest level, you've got 20 teams in the Premier League, you know, so that's on average 2 to 3 sports scientists maybe per team. You know, you're looking at anywhere between 36 and 54 places for, you know, out of 1,200 possible students each year going to work in professional football, and they're not spaces that come available very often. So a lot of what people are looking at these days is not what your qualifications are, because, you know, it's a little bit like saying you're either a professional footballer or you're not. You know, there are the good ones and there are the ones that play sort of Conference South and the lower divisions and stuff. But, you know, it's more about what are the skills that you have the ability to do. And I think, you know, certainly life skills becomes more important. And I'd say I touched on communication, but I think it's about having empathy, and it's about building relationships with people and being able to kind of bring the best out of each person individually, because, you know, everyone responds differently to different things at different times. I think it's about planning your future, you know, and having a clear pathway. I think I mentioned this already about how you know, where you want to be in. It's in 5 years' time. It sounds a bit, you know, of a corny phrase, you know, that we all get asked. But I think, you know, in sport, if you want to work at that level, it's really important that you know where you're going, and knowing what skills you need to get there. And spending as much time with people in different sports, different backgrounds, and just building up your ability to coach as an individual. You know, I'm a therapist as a trade, but we all end up coaching in some way, shape, or form. You know, so through the way we communicate. So, you know, a lot of it is about the soft skills, which that doesn't get taught at university, not near enough compared to the technical skills. And I think you're starting to find now in elite sport that teams and clubs will take on someone who's not necessarily, you know, an A-grade student, but has the ability to kind of integrate and build into a team really quickly. And then they will help them develop them skills, you know, and then promote them through from an academy through to a first team, if that's the direction they want to go. I think it's also important that, depending on what your route is, when you leave school into education, whether you want to be a sports scientist, a strength and conditioning coach, physiotherapist, is that you're really clear on that's what you want to do. You know, I've come across students, particularly sports therapy students, that have come in and they want to be a strength and conditioning coach, but they come in interview for a soft tissue therapy job because they see it as an opportunity to get their foot in the door, and then all they want to do is become an S&C coach. And it's like, you know, that you'll get found out, you know, and, you know, that's not the right approach to take. You know, pick a pathway, decide what you want to do, and then start developing and nurturing those skills to ensure that you give yourself the best opportunity to get to that level. But don't expect to walk in at that level at the beginning. You know, it may be that you've got to do, you know, age group stuff, you know, semi-professional stuff for a long time before you build up the experiences that you need to work at that top level.
Brilliant. Yeah, answered loads there. Thanks very much. Does anybody else have any questions? Stephen? Mute.
There we go. I got it. Andy, there's a lot of homemade stuff at the moment going around where people can use foam rollers and little balls and stuff. I just bought one of these bad boys the other day. Are they any good? Will it as my advancing years and helping my recovery, are those things any good? Foam rollers and what do they call these things?
The irony of that question, I've just spoke to a reporter in the week for an article which is coming out this week about the Theragun and percussion therapy and vibration technology and guns such as that. Yeah. I think, you know, I'll kind of say what I said to him really is that, like anything, it's about how you knowing how to use it, when to use it, and what's most appropriate to get out of it what you want, you know. And I think particularly with percussion therapy and the likes of the Theragun, is there's very limited scientific evidence, if any, out there as to the benefits of it, and used too much in the wrong areas can actually cause more damage than it can good. I think it probably has its place. I think if you're trying to replace appropriate therapy with a bit of technology, you're probably going about it the wrong way. I think it's important that, you know, particularly with anyone with an injury or the need to recover, is that it goes back to what I was saying earlier about doing the basics, you know, whether, you know, things like Compex, things like the Theragun, things like cryotherapy chambers, ice baths, all of these are adjuncts really. They're not the fundamental basis of physiological recovery. You know, if you've got your 99% of it nailed and it's consistent and you're doing it properly, then there's no harm in kind of adding that little bit more. But if you're not doing that initially and you're just relying on, you know, a pneumatic drill to kind of get rid of you know, things you don't want in your legs, then you're probably going at it the wrong way. You're trying to row against the tide, I think. So I'm not saying I'm not an advocate of it, because I think there's equally more cost-effective and more appropriate ways of delivering appropriate recovery. Not to say that won't change, but, you know, I think until we can kind of evidence its benefits, I think it's a nice business and marketing strategy than it is a medical tool at this moment in time. So I hope you didn't spend too much on it.
Yeah, we wasted our money there, eh? Brilliant, great. I'll send that back. It's not even unpackaged yet, so it's going back. Anybody else? Anybody else have any questions? Okay, just before we wrap it up then, Andy, what about we're going to have hopefully a few of our year 11 students and some of our RBs that are off to leave. What would you say to anybody who was thinking about taking, going into your profession or into, you know, one of those other areas within that profession?
What, in terms of advice for them, or
would you? I mean, would you recommend it as a career? I mean, you obviously you've been very lucky and worked at that very elite level, but you also had the private practice side. So, is it something if you could go back, would you still do? Would you still want to do today what you did? Make that choice then?
Yeah, I mean, I don't regret any decisions that I've made. You know, I think along the way you kind of, you know, you have a choice about, you know, where you go and what you do. And I've probably had opportunities to work in other bigger teams, and, you know, in the past, which I've turned down because they weren't right for me at that right moment in time. You know, I think it's just really important to stress that, you know, I'm now 42. So, you know, I have, been in it 15 years, got a young family. And if you, so the working in elite sport is very demanding, you know, particularly in football. And if you've got a young family, you know, you have other things that are very important to you outside of work, then you have to ensure that there's a balance there, really. You know, there's a lot of traveling involved with football. There's, you know, I've worked 3 weeks in a row. You know, Christmas doesn't really exist. You know, it's just another day towards another game. You live off days of the week being match day -4, match day -3, match day -2. What month are we in? What day of the week is it? That kind of thing. You know, so, you know, I certainly think that football is a young person's as a practitioner on the ground, it's definitely a young person's game. Before you really get to that point where you think about settling down and having a family, which is the reason why I'm now not working in football, because it's just too much time away. And I want to be at home with my family and see my children grow up. So and I think, it's a lot of time, and it's a lot of hard work. It looks glamorous on the TV, and yes, you get to go to some fantastic places if you're fortunate enough. But don't underestimate, the hard work and the unsociable hours and living in and out of hotels and things like that. So if you look at all of that and you think, fine, great, then absolutely go for it. But I think you have to be honest with yourself about what you want to do. You can't get into these environments and go, well, I'm going to pick the hours I want to do, or hope to still get your weekends back and stuff, because it doesn't work like that. So my advice would be, I think, again, don't set your hopes on one particular environment you want to work in from the offset. I know football's the glamorous one, and probably for a lot of professions, it's the one that pays the most as well, because it can. But expose yourself to lots of different opportunities and lots of different environments, because without that, how do you know which one is right for you? And a lot of skills and a lot of knowledge can be transferable, and that. So yeah, I think it's important really to stress that what the reality of what it's like versus the perception of what it's like is two very different things.
Great, brilliant. Jackie?
I was just going to thank you for talking to us this afternoon. I found that really, really interesting. And what I like about it as well is that when we speak to people like yourself that work in the profession out of the educational setting, the things that we do and the things that we talk to them about and things that we teach them in sports science, and just to touch on a few of the things you mentioned, like periodization, types of recovery, the importance of diet and nutrition, principle trainings, the use of GPS data and notational analysis. These are things that we teach within the curriculum. So what's really nice is to know that we're not just teaching it to them because it's what it is. It's actually the way that sport works at that elite level, and the application and the real life use of that. So I find that really interesting. So thank you.
Pleasure.
Yeah. So yeah, go on. Sorry, Andy.
No, it's just, there's a number of different, sort of roles and that I haven't really touched on. And I think, one thing I haven't really kind of mentioned much about, which I think again it's important to understand in terms of, where someone might want to go in terms of their degree program and stuff. Like Jackie, you just mentioned about notational analysis, and I think the technological advances, and particularly in terms of data management and data collection, is probably the one that's grown exponentially, since particularly in sport and in football over the last 10, 15 years, and what's available. And, I think it's, if anyone's, there's a lot of people out there that are not necessarily IT proficient or data, they don't have, data and understand the ability to understand data effectively. I think that's another skill that's certainly important, whether you're a therapist or whether you're a strength and conditioning coach or even a nutrition and stuff like that. I think in every profession, data is finding its way into it, and is becoming more and more important. And then how we visualize that data, because it's up until this pandemic that we're in, time is very short. Decisions have to be made quickly, and how we get across and how we communicate data and how we communicate meaningful information is really important and stuff. So I think that's also an area that people can look to develop. I know we're in a generation where probably you know, the ones we're teaching are more advanced than probably the ones that are teaching, you know. You know, I think it's important to develop those areas as much as possible, because I think, you know, those type of roles will become bigger and bigger within sports teams. We're now starting to see, you know, football teams employ data technicians and data engineers, and they're actually being employed by football clubs to build their athlete management systems, and to build their programs, and to code everything they need. So we had that at Swansea. We were fortunate enough to have a guy who was, you know, clever enough to be able to just write code and build our own sort of dashboards that worked for us, you know, that we knew no other club would be using. So I think there are things, potential areas to think about, which are in small minority at the moment. But I think fast forward another 10 years, you know, I think there'll be a lot more roles available in elite sport for people that have got the skills and the ability to build the right technology for elite sports teams.
No, I was just going to say, because it just doesn't seem that long ago that we all thought Prozone was like this huge thing, don't we? And now we're like, you know, it's progressed so much from there to the data and everything that we have available now. And I know that you mentioned that as well, like utilising data, but I think you said something about forming a conversation, and I like that. So it forms a narrative about what you do next. It's not something that you know, it's part of the process. And I think you're right. It'd be interesting to see where it goes to next.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, for sure. So, but you know, regardless of how far it moves, you know, the human physiology doesn't change, you know, and there's a lot around about injury prediction, injury prevention, reduction, whatever terminology you want to use, you know, and tissue still heals at the rate at which it heals, you know, and you may be able to kind of take a couple of months off something, but then at what cost and at what risk, you know, and you know, from that information, do you start to identify trends of what the secondary injury is as a result of the primary injury sort of being moved forwards a couple of months? You know, you hear reports of ACLs being rehabbed and back to full training within 6 months, and you think, okay, well, great, but at what cost will that be in the next 3 months or the next 6 months? You know, so you know, it's yeah, I think sometimes we have to be careful about how far we're trying to push things, and just actually be realistic about, you know, you'd rather have a player return once from an injury and not 3 times from a repeat injury, because you've got them back earlier each time.
Yeah, I think Mrs. Lee will take note of that. We won't rush. Anybody else? No. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Andy. I hope
Pleasure.
Our students who listen have learned a fair bit. I know I have, just listening just for that sort of 35 minutes. So thank you very much for giving up your time and your Sunday afternoon to come and share your expertise with us. It's very much appreciated.
Take care of yourselves. Stay well, stay healthy, and
You too. Look after yourself.
You too. Bye-bye.